I like the iced tea. Okay, I'm glad everybody's got their beverages ready to go. We're gonna get started in just a minute. If you don't have your beverages ready to go or your cat settled on your lap, now is your chance to get it all good to go. I'm a big proponent of cats on your lap as we're getting going. Okay, it's 5:30, so I think we'll get started. Hello, friends, and welcome to History Happy Hour in the service of mercy. My name is Callie McCune, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Indiana Historical Society. It's so great to have you all here tonight. This happy hour is brought to you with support from Lake City Bank, offering online banking, mobile banking, and actual go into the branch banking. You can find out all that information at lakecitybank.com. At the Indiana Historical Society, we're Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. And we do that by collecting millions upon millions of pieces of paper that tell Indiana's unique stories. Those are in things like books and paintings, letters and photographs, diaries, maps. And then we find intriguing and interesting ways to share them and remember the past, whether that's through publications, exhibitions, or events like this. It's through these pieces that we tell the diverse, unconventional, sometimes saucy stories of Indiana and to inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. With the anniversary of Armistice Day and Veterans Day coming up just next week, we wanted to take a moment to dive into the stories of some of the Hoosiers who served during World War I. And I'm so excited for you to hear more about the work that Amber's doing down in Evansville and how she's helping her community to uncover the important and fascinating heroes of Vanderburgh County. Amber knows that we love to come down and visit her and hear about all the things that she's digging into in her archive and how she's able to share that with her community and remember people from the past that we don't always get to talk about. But before I introduce Amber and Bethany, our moderator, to get us started, I have just a couple pieces of logistics. So for this event, Amber and Bethany will chat for about 30 minutes and we'll open it up to your questions. If you do have questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A section on the webinar software. You can find that at the very bottom of your screen. And Bethany's pointing it out for me handily with her mouse. We know you're all muted tonight, but we do want to hear your thoughts. Please add things to the chat as we go along. Just make sure that you're replying to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your reply. And that's a little drop-down menu when you go to put your comments into the chat. And then keep an eye on the chat for links and URLs. I'll be putting those in as we go along tonight. If you miss one, don't worry. Most of the links will be delivered to you in your inbox tomorrow morning in a thank you email. Just so you know, this program is being recorded and you'll be able to catch the replay on our website, indianahistory.org, in the upcoming weeks. If you enjoy this program, we hope you'll consider coming back for more. We have 2 more History Happy Hours for the year. Join us on November 19th as we learn about Hoosier writer Kurt Vonnegut, and then on December 30th, where we look into the history of Kwanzaa. You can sign up for this at indianahistory.org for more information and other virtual offerings coming to an internet-connected device near you. So without further ado, I'm going to toss this over to Bethany Rakovic, Director of Education and Engagement at the Indiana Historical Society, to get us started. Hey, Bethany, how's it going tonight?
Callie, it's going great. Thank you. And it is my absolute pleasure to get to introduce our moderator, our presenter tonight, Amber Gowen. Amber is the archivist for the Vanderburgh County Clerk's Office, where Amber is responsible for over 200 years of county records. She has spearheaded the digitization and preservation of key late 19th and early 20th century vital records, with a focus on bringing these stories back into the community. You'll notice a trend here of that community focus that Amber has. Amber also serves on the board of the Vanderburgh County Historical Society and History Steering Committee with the Evansville Museum of Art, History, and Science. Her research centers on Evansville women in the Prohibition and World War I eras. She is the 2018 recipient of the Stan Harris Citizens Award, presented by the Indiana Council for the Social Studies, and the 2019 recipient of the Dorothy Riker Hoosier Historian Award, presented by the Indiana Historical Society. Amber's current project focuses on is called In Service of Mercy, which focuses on Evansville's women in World War I. Amber, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm so excited to get to talk to you more about this project.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So at all of our history happy hours, we like to start off just knowing what everyone's drinking tonight. So if you have a beverage that you're drinking, feel free to drop it in the chat. And Amber, what are you having tonight?
Nothing exciting, just a little LaCroix in my favorite Yeti.
Ooh, LaCroix sounds nice. I am just plain boring water as well myself tonight. I imagine you're like me and just came from work.
Yes.
So to get us started tonight, could you give us just a little bit of an overview of what In Service of Mercy is, what the scope of the project is, and kind of how it came to be?
Sure. I've been working on the In Service of Mercy project for going on about 3.5 years now. We partnered with the Evansville Wartime Museum and the Tri-State Women Veterans Organization to sort of bring this project to life. The scope of the project is a documentary that we're working on. The timeline got a little messed up with the whole COVID situation, but we're still moving forward. Eventually, we'd like to see an exhibit at the Evansville Wartime Museum. And because there's just never enough space or time to tell these stories, I'd like to begin to write down the whole story in some type of a written form, whether that be a book or what. I'm not quite sure yet, because there's just never enough time for all the stories that you can tell.
Well, when you get that book written, you know I need a signed copy of it. So for those who may not be as familiar with World War I and America's impact in the war, could you give us just a little bit of a context into the role the U.S. played in World War I, and then kind of more specifically Evansville? Because I know I was kind of surprised at the how strong of a role Evansville played in the war effort.
Sure. And as far as the war in general, it broke out in Europe in 1914. And that's when the first 2 women from Evansville went to Europe to serve as nurses. They were Belgian immigrants, and they decided to go home and serve in the Belgian Red Cross. So these were younger girls in their 20s who had jobs at local retail stores, and then they left to go to war. So within the course of 3 or 4 months, they go from modeling clothes at the Andres department store to being on the battlefield in Belgium. For the U.S. involvement, it's not till April of 1917 that we get involved. And, there are many, many thousands of pages that have been written that can tell you exactly how that came to be. But the Cliff Notes version is there was conflict over shipping. German submarines were sinking various transport ships, and American citizens were killed there as well. There was a telegram where Germany wanted to unite or ally with Mexico. So a lot of things at play, a lot of politics at play. And we enter the war in April of 1917. We had a small army then, just over 100,000 men in the military at that time. You had roughly 200 nurses. So we had a very small military. And if we were going to be combat effective in Europe, we had to build it. We had to put in a draft system. We had to build the training camps to put all of those men in, and then we had to train them. So it was a rush job all the way through. And Europe, our allies knew that it was going to take time to ramp up. There were some estimates that said we wouldn't be combat effective till 1919. And it was, kind of March, April of 1918 before we really saw men in battle. But what we could do almost immediately was provide medical personnel. Europe was exhausted. The major battles, it was a stalemate, trench warfare, and the first industrial war, where we found new and inventive ways to kill each other in new and horrific ways. So that required a lot of medical personnel. And in 1916, the medical community in the United States really began to realize that this was a real possibility that we would find ourselves involved in the conflict. And if we didn't, a lot of them were planning to go anyway with the Red Cross because they saw the medical need. So the actual first bodies on the ground in Europe were those medical companies. And in Evansville, that meant that we had women in France before we had male soldiers. Back in the city itself, our story is very similar to the rest of the country. We had factories that changed over to certain wartime productions. We had Bucyrus, which made ammunition or shells for a while. And then women took over a lot of jobs for men as they got drafted, which we think of as World War II. But the precursor to that in Evansville is World War I. It sets the precedent for everything the city will do 20 years later. And basically, we send 150 women to war. And they get there and they've seen battle and the injuries that war can cause before the men in our city get there. And that's sort of where the story begins.
Yeah. How many people from Evansville contributed to the war effort?
Well, depending on how you define war effort, you have around 3,000 men who were drafted. You had approximately 150 who were women. And then, of course, every woman in town was knitting socks and, really doing anything you could possibly do. They were making pillowcases and nightgowns and slippers and just anything you can think of, that because we didn't have the mass production for those kind of things during World War I. And the soldiers, we sent a lot of the Army men and the Marines overseas with very little equipment because they put the priority on shipping the soldiers instead of all of their equipment. So they had to go to France or England to be outfitted even with their rifles. And some of them hadn't even shot a rifle yet before they got to France or England to be trained by the Allies before they could even go up to a front line or a trench.
Yeah, so really it sounds like all of the Evansville women, regardless of if they were at home or overseas, had such a massive influence on the contribution to the war effort. And so you mentioned kind of these 150 who served as nurses in this medical field. That's a big number of women, I feel, to be going overseas. And am I correct in that your project In Service of Mercy focuses on those 150, correct?
It does focus on the 150 women. We can really tell the whole story of the U.S. involvement in the war through Evansville women. We had at least one woman do almost everything that a woman was allowed to do during that war. The only thing I haven't found is I did not find any women that served as the telephone operators. But other than that, we had a woman who served as a Marine. We had several who served as yeomen in the Navy, who were the first women allowed to be enlisted in the Navy. We had nurses. We had the youngest war worker in the nation who worked with the Salvation Army. We had a YMCA, several YMCA workers. We had women who joined the Overseas Theater League that entertained troops in the precursor to the USO. We had women that volunteered for the Coast Guard. And then we also had a large number of what they called the Student Nurse Reserve members. So these were young women when fighting picked up and US did start to actually fight, and then we started to receive large numbers of casualties. It became very apparent that we didn't have enough nurses. Evansville, we had about 112 registered, trained, professional nurses who'd gone to the nursing schools in the city, and about 60 of them were tapped for the war effort. So at a certain point, the Mayor Bossy, was contacting the federal government, going, "Hey, wait a minute, no one's going to be here to take care of my sick residents. You need to stop taking my nurses." And that was happening in community after community in the United States. So the kind of fix was to create the Student Nurse Reserve Program. And they really targeted the leisure class, really those elite society women who, a lot of those women were in women's colleges. So they were definitely more wealthy and had the time to dedicate to spend 2 years in a nursing school. So the war basically ended before that program got up and running, but that didn't that doesn't take away from the willingness of those women to go and to serve as they were asked, even if they didn't get fully implemented the way it was envisioned.
I love that. I had never heard of that program, so I'm glad you brought that up. How did you discover, I mean, everyone I feel kind of knows the men's story when it comes to war and war effort. How did you discover some of these women's stories? And as you mentioned, all of the different roles that these women filled, how did you go about discovering those stories and then piecing them together for, you know, this eventual documentary and hopefully the book and everything else that comes from it?
Well, the story began in just doing my regular job. In the archives, we found an unlabeled box, and I opened the box, and there's another box inside of it, and that box contained a ledger. It said World War I veterans. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I have an interest in military history. I'll flip through it for a little bit, which I did, and those were all the male residents who received a pension for serving in World War I. And then in the very, very back, there's this little pamphlet, and it says female veterans of World War I. And I went, hang on, I need to know everything right now. And that's where it began. So that list only had 33 names on it. And those 33 were, 1, women who actually claimed a pension, and 2, women who served overseas in France, because the military and the government were very picky on who they would classify as a veteran of service. For example, we think about the first men that were killed in France, as one of them being James Bethel Gresham from Evansville. But there were 2 nurses who were killed on a ship, in May of 1917 because of a friendly fire accident, but they weren't tabulated as military casualties because they were women. They considered that to be a civilian casualty. So you have to start peeling back all of those layers. And, I cast a very wide net. So in telling this story, I don't really care how the government classified you. If you were willing to serve, I'm counting you. And, also that definition has changed over time. The Marine Corps didn't necessarily want to always count the 300 female Marines for a while, and then they did. So, for as far as like discovering the information on individual women, it's just pulling back all the pieces you can. You start with a name, and you try to find any newspaper articles that have, and then you get those family details sometimes, because the women that I'm studying are primarily, middle to upper middle class women, just because of the qualifications needed to qualify for these positions. So, there's another story to be told about the working class women in Evansville and their contributions during the war. But for the scope of this project, that did help me some, because these women were more likely to be mentioned in the society pages, and their families were more likely to be accounted for in any number of large and small events within the city. And also their families were more likely to publicize the role of these women during the war, because it was a little bit of a prestige thing. So they wanted you to know that their daughter was over in France and what she was doing. And of course, the newspapers at that time were a lot more generous in what they would publish. So in some cases, they actually published the letters the women sent back from France, which helped because you can get a unit name, and then you can start tracking that through military records.
I feel like I know the subject of your next book and next project, which is going to be looking at the working class women in Evansville, and I'm going to be just as excited to talk to you about that one too. But you mentioned that you were able to find some of these women's stories. Do you have some stories? I know you brought you have some images for us today, so do you have some women's stories that you could highlight for us as examples of how women contributed and kind of that scope?
Sure. I don't know, who do you have up first on the image? We can start there. So this is Pearl Chanley, and Pearl Chanley was one of the first 300 Marines to ever serve in the United States Marine Corps. So she was 20 years old when she did so. She had a background in stenography and secretarial work. And that was her contribution in the war effort. The Marine Corps wanted to release men to fight, so they brought women in to do those office jobs stateside, so they could release those men overseas. So Pearl's main job was to work in headquarters with the Marine Corps in Washington, D.C. And she wrote a memoir in 1984 that she gave to the Marine Corps Historical Division. And one of the things she said really encompasses the whole project for me, because she said, "Oh, the stories that I could tell you, but no one wants to listen." So what we're trying to do is listen for the first time the best we can, from 100 plus years after the war. But Pearl, the other thing she said that really struck out to me in her memoir was, she said, "We didn't go to war. We weren't allowed to go to war, but our hearts were with you," because her job was to track the belongings of men who were killed in action as they left France and were sent back home for the families. And then she would notify the families of soldiers who were killed in the war and make sure those belongings were mailed to the correct person. It wasn't supposed to be this way. The families were supposed to be notified by the military, by someone else in the military for initial contact. But just because of the way things, the bureaucratic entanglements, sometimes she was the first person to contact a mother and tell that mother that her son had been killed in a war. And that was an incredible burden to carry for those women. So she said, "We weren't allowed to serve, but our hearts served with you because we knew where you were from the time you got off the ship to the time your belongings came home to your mother."
That's a beautiful sentiment. It's such a rich painting with the words that she was able to pull. That's a treasured find.
Yes.
I feel. How about this one?
That is a photo from Aline Els, who later marries an Iglehart and becomes Aline Els Iglehart. And she was one of the that class of women who were at elite women's colleges who had the money and the ability to do that kind of advanced study. And when they were called, or when she was notified that they had a student nurse reserve program, she decided to leave her studies at the University of Wisconsin and enroll. And she was one of about 14 women that were actually called up and activated. And she was sent to a stateside camp. And at that camp, you were supposed to basically train as a nurse. And it was supposed to be sort of an accelerated course of study. They wanted these women because they already had college experience. So they had an idea of what their capacity to learn quickly was. So you're supposed to, in the morning, you're supposed to go to your classes. And then in the afternoon, you went straight to the wards and you started learning your practical hands-on skill. And she did that for a while. And then we got the 1918 flu epidemic. So all of these student nurses became nurses in that moment. Sorry, there's too much pollen in Evansville today. But all of these women immediately became nurses as soon as the flu broke out, and that became their main contribution to the war effort. They treated all of the soldiers in these massive outbreaks of illness that happened on these military camps. And they would work under graduate trained nurses, but a lot of times, they were on their own just because they were so overwhelmed. So they saved a lot of lives by taking those skills that they learned on the job and then applied them immediately with the epidemic and with the sick soldiers.
Since you mentioned the flu of 1918, I'm curious, how did that affect the war effort overseas? And was Evansville really impacted by it, other than the nurses having to step up in a way they may not have been ready for?
Yeah, it's undeniable that that it was one of the major moments of impact in the war. So as far as the fighting goes, there were moments where they had to essentially stop fighting because they didn't have enough well people to keep shooting at each other on either side. So that's what's happening with the soldiers. At the base hospitals where the overseas nurses are, they not only have to worry about treating wounded men, they have to treat sick men, and then they have to treat themselves. So these nurses, some of them were working 20 hours a day in the cold, in the wet, sleeping in housing that had a dirt floor and basically a tent or plywood that was put up very quickly. So they were already susceptible to illness because they were run down and because of the weather conditions. But they didn't have time to be sick because they had to treat all these other men. And it was almost an impossible task asked of them. But they did it. We had one woman, they landed in Italy. Sister Lucia was one of only 10 Catholic nuns who were called into service by the military and allowed to serve in World War I. And they went to Italy. And when they landed in Italy, they basically landed a week before the outbreak happened. So it was sick nurse after sick nurse after sick nurse after sick nurse. And then they would hear from home. So there are people at home who are dying and their relatives are dying. So this is a time of immense grief and immense worry because they had no way to help at home either. And then it wasn't without consequence. As a city, we lost more soldiers to the effects of the influenza outbreak than we did in combat. We didn't lose any nurses in the war years, the bracketed war years of 1914 to 1918. But that doesn't mean it didn't have long-term consequences. Many of the women who contracted the flu because of their service died prematurely than they would have had they not contracted the flu, because it did weaken their heart or their lungs. And so, we had 3 or 4 who died within, 4 years of their service, and then more who died within 10. And then others who would talk a lot about the sort of emotional impacts long-term of having to deal with seeing so much death at once. And then the horrific ways that men would die of the flu. And what that looked like on the physical level, and then how they would have to carry that for the rest of their lives.
Imagining everything they went through and just all of that grief that they went through. I'm amazed more of them didn't die sooner, just from the sheer weight of the burdens that they carried.
Right. I saw a question come up about which woman was Iglehart. She's on my right, so she's got the kind of flat hat there, where the other woman's is a little bit more pointed. Yeah, that's her. That's Aline.
You're Zoom Pro. You see all the questions in there too.
just that one. Just that one. And then that's Emma. Emma is one of the German immigrants in Evansville. German immigrants had a rough time during the war. In Evansville in particular, it really became a bit of a divided city. She sort of represents that because she had family members in Germany, and she spoke German, and that made it a bit of a liability for her to serve. She was investigated for, maybe being a spy or having her loyalties questioned. It all sort of went away. The government came, they investigated. They're like, yeah, there's nothing here. She already served in the army in 1911, so it was really fast. They're like, there's nothing here. It was more of an interpersonal conflict from someone who she got a job that woman wanted. So she got a loyalty investigation because of it. But she did incredible work in Rouen, France. She was one of those first 6 base hospital units that landed in France in May of 1917. And they had a hard job because not only were they really the first to see what the war meant in real life and not in sort of the recruiting posters, but they also had to represent the United States of America. They were basically asked to be diplomats as well. They had to go to teas and dinners and sometimes meet the royal family in Britain. And really be that face, that diplomatic face of America after they got off their shift of treating wounded soldiers. So we asked a lot of these women, and they delivered every time.
Again, that burden that these women have is just insane, and it just keeps getting more and more. I'm curious about those loyalty checks that you mentioned, knowing that especially at this time, you know, Indiana has a fairly strong German population. Was that common, even among soldiers, that they would have loyalty checks?
If as long as you didn't speak out too much as a soldier, you know, they needed the bodies, so they were, you know, a little less likely to look at you too hard, as long as you weren't a pacifist or, you know, sort of a avowed communist. But for a lot of the like farmers, some of the farmers in the German townships in Evansville, you know, we had one get arrested because he stated at a bar that he didn't want his son to be drafted and have to fight in France, which, you know, to me seems like a reasonable sentiment. But it was enough to, you know, really threaten his livelihood and his freedom. And we had a German speaking minister who was actually interred in one of the internment camps. And he, you know, spent the remainder of the war in a camp held by the United States government. So, you know, it was very serious business. You know, it's easy to kind of laugh a little bit about the story with Emma because it turned out okay. But for a lot of German families in the United States during that period, it did not turn out okay. And, you know, their lives and their businesses and livelihoods were taken as a result of that.
Obviously, there's an incredible impact overseas with what was going on at the time with fighting against Germans. How much did that anti-German sentiment really affect Evansville proper? Was that kind of bleeding through the ranks, so to speak, or did that kind of stay confined to those who were going to go overseas and fight?
It was a complicated time because up until the U.S. declared war, we had, you know, German-speaking newspapers that were printing war news from the German side. We had civic organizations who were donating money to the German Red Cross and to the funds for soldiers, widows, and orphans for German soldiers, because there's a lot of people with family members that are caught up in it, and, you know, they're getting drafted on that side too. So it became really harsh for a large number of people. Our naturalization book in the city is actually the largest that we have when naturalization was done at the municipal level in 1917, because half our city council and elected officials had to go get their naturalization finished because they'd just never gotten around to it. And they were German. So suddenly that became a real problem. And then, you know, we lost all of our German speaking newspapers in that period. They were just forced out of business. And then they were never able to recover.
Well, so this next lady that we've got an image of, I'm really fascinated by because of how young she looks. Pulling her up now, Ms. Mary, she seems so young.
Yeah, we, you know, while the professional trained nurses, they were a little bit older because that you had to have at least 3 years experience after nursing school to qualify to go overseas as a professional nurse, because they needed you to be able to kind of be able to work on your own and not, you know, innovate and not need a lot of supervision, because you're just not going to get it. There were too many wounded men and not enough nurses. The student nurses, the student nurse reserve members, they were all younger. So you're basically looking at 18 to 22, 23 for the majority of women who volunteered for that program. So Mary is just turned 20. And she is the only woman who actually finishes the program. So while other women get released after the war and decide to go back to whatever it was they were doing before, she actually decided to become a nurse through the program, finish it out. She spent the full, 2.5 years and then carried on afterwards. So she is a little bit unique because she is younger. And then the only one younger than her, because Pearl Chanley is also 20, serving the Marine Corps, and then Stella Carmichael at 19 is actually the youngest woman who served in Evansville. And remember, at age 21 is really sort of when you weren't considered a minor anymore as a woman. So that affected it a little bit. Stella Carmichael, she served with the Salvation Army, and she was hand selected by the leader of the Salvation Army to go do this. She was considered that good at the kind of aid work that she would be doing to be chosen despite her younger age. Because the Army didn't really want that many young women. They were kind of afraid that there would be too many marriages or relationships or flirtations. So they didn't want younger women all that much. But she was allowed to stay because she landed in France 2 weeks before Pershing put a 21-year-old age limit on the qualifications. So she got to snuck in there right under the wire.
Oh, that is fascinating. I swear it just must be because I'm getting older. She looks so much younger than 20. I'll do a quick reminder for everyone. If you do have any questions, we'll be transitioning to your questions for Amber shortly in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So if you do have any, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can drop them in that Q&A section and we will get to them. Amber, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our next Mary on the list.
Sure. One of the unique things about the women who served in Evansville is for the women that served overseas, there actually weren't that many that were given combat awards or even recognition by the military in the form of medals or citations, certificates. For the class of award that was given most often, about 28 women received that, and Evansville had 2 of them. So Mary Arvin actually became one of, if not the most decorated nurse in the war. She went with the Harvard unit, the Harvard Base Hospital unit, and they just didn't have any good luck through the whole course of that war. They kept getting targeted by bombing raids by the Germans. So we know more about that the first time she was in an air raid because somehow she managed to sneak a couple of letters home that didn't get read by censors. So we know a little bit more about what that experience for her was like. And she was basically watching over her ward at night and writing a letter at her desk. And then they get bombed by German airplanes came in and dropped bombs on the hospital. And she was thrown out of her chair and across the room, and the windows broke in the building and things were on fire. And she had to clear her ward of wounded men who kind of wanted her to stay undercover and be safe. And she wasn't about to hear that. She got up and got everybody to safety and made sure that people who were, had their post-traumatic stress triggered, were calmed down and comforted. And that was her introduction to the war.
Quite an introduction to have there, right?
Right. And then it happened again. And that's how she ended up as one of the most decorated nurses that the Americans sent overseas. She was decorated by the French. She was eventually decorated by General Pershing in the U.S. Army. And she was also decorated by the British after the war, where she was given her British medal by a member of the royal family.
Was that common? Obviously, you said she was one of the most decorated. Did that happen, I guess, infrequently? Are we talking like in the tens or less of women that were honored with decorations of any type during the war?
For those that were receiving actual medals, that number is pretty low. It's a little bit hard to track. The military records differ a little bit, but I'm comfortable putting it at like less than 130 out of 20,000. For those that receive the equivalent of a Silver Star, that's about 8. And then the numbers who received a citation by the U.S. Army, like a commendation citation, that was a little bit larger. That was a couple hundred, but still, when you're looking at the number of women who served in general, it's a small percentage. The French and the British were more willing, more generous with their awards than the American Army was. So, so there's more citations from the Allied governments to American nurses than there were citations from the American government to American nurses. So it was pretty rare.
Would you hazard a guess as to why the European governments might be a little bit more free with their recognition?
A couple of things. Just they'd been at war longer, and they had a more direct. The war had a more direct impact on the populace. So there was no, protecting your women in Europe. Like you were living it as much as anyone else fighting, because they're refugees, and villages are getting targeted and bombed, and fighting was going through civilian areas. The casualties were just so much larger. So there wasn't a woman in Europe who didn't have multiple male family members who were killed. So I think that was part of it. It's just they were willing to look at an action and say that was an action that deserves to be awarded, male or female. One of our tri-state women veterans is a combat nurse from Iraq, and she will tell you that it was sexism. There's a fair amount of documentation that would support that. It really depended on who had to sign your paperwork. One of our nurses, Emma Byrne, she did not have a supportive nurse, or did not have a supportive doctor or supervisor. So she actually faced discrimination, like active discrimination, and wrote about it and tried to have someone intervene on her behalf. We don't hear, they didn't really have the language to describe what they were facing that way. And for a lot of women, they had good experiences. And, these are women that are serving with millions of men and very small numbers of women. But there were women that did have bad experiences, and Emma was one of those. So she was held back in her career because of the male supervisor that she had, a doctor who didn't believe that she should be there. So that was difficult. They had to persevere through a lot of those things. And so, Susan, our combat nurse that advises on this project, she would say that there was a strain of that was very strong in 1918, and you still see that somewhat today.
So you mentioned kind of early on that the women who were able to, participate as nurses and go through some of the schooling were kind of a privileged group of women, just with the qualifications they needed to have, and how that was left to the women of the upper classes. But one of the questions that we just had come in, have you found any documentation about World War I nurses who are women of color? And if you have or haven't, do we know of any women of color who were able to serve in any capacity? And if so, what did they do?
Sure. This was a period of time where there was a lot of discrimination. Male soldiers weren't even allowed to serve with white men. So the Harlem Hellfighters unit of soldiers was attached to the French army to fight for many reasons. And having so many training camps in the South was part of that reason. And a lot of the Southern states didn't want to let Black men be officers. So, there was all of those racial politics and discrimination issues were happening for women as well as men. Nursing and the medical community was very segregated and very prejudiced. So there were some women that were allowed into nursing schools. I believe the majority of them came from historically Black colleges and universities, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But I know of some of them, if not all of them. They were a small number though. When we get to the student nurse reserve program specifically, I know one of our nurses, she returned to France, and towards the later in there, when we're coming up on Armistice, she was recruiting for the student nurse reserve, and she wanted to find Black women to serve as nurses for Black men in these, particularly in Southern camps, because she knew that there was a need and she was very explicit about that. We know that in Evansville, there may have been 13 or so that were willing to sign up. It does not appear they were allowed to even fill out the paperwork. So we don't have names. We don't have really anything more than an idea or a willingness or, like a raised hand at a meeting. The Army itself drug their feet on the issue of Black women as nurses for a long time. It wasn't until after Armistice that any Black women were allowed to serve as nurses. That was mostly due to the flu epidemic. And I believe 18 was the total number of Black women who were allowed to serve as nurses in World War I. And they were not sent to France. I think there were a few other Black women who volunteered with either charity groups or with European-based organizations, but that's still a very small number.
Still astounding that you were able to find that much. So if you mentioned that you can't find necessarily names and some of that. How do you figure out that there's even a hint of women of color who are participating, and how does that show up in the records?
In Evansville specifically, or more broadly?
In Evansville, but if there is a documentation in Evansville more broadly.
Well, in Evansville, it's just the one document where Catherine Reisteiner is puts it out in the paper, because there's this big recruitment happening, because they're trying to recruit like 18,000 student nurses in the course of a month. And each county has X number that they're looking for. So I just have that one document where she's saying, I would like to, and come to this place on this date. And then we know, like, they had a meeting and X number of people may have shown up. How many were white and how many were Black? Hard to say. But I worked with the Evansville African American Museum, and we were able to sort of pinpoint that as best guess about 13.
Also, if our audience hasn't been to any of these wonderful Evansville museums that Amber has mentioned tonight, I highly recommend it. Each and every one of them she has mentioned is a phenomenal institution. So whenever it is safe to do so, I highly encourage a road trip down to Evansville or a visit down the street if you are from there. Amber, as we're kind of in our last little bit of questions here, what happened to these women when they returned home? They went through so much. They shouldered so much burden overseas. Did they just go back to their jobs? What happened to them?
That's the most interesting question to answer in this project. Every woman had a different story. Women did go back to their jobs for professional nurses. Some of them, that meant they spent the rest of their career in nursing. And some of them did incredible things. They went to study at Harvard, or, we had one nurse who became one of the first trained women at Evansville in polio treatment. Another worked on the team that implemented insulin as a diabetes cure or treatment. We had women that studied in Boston Children's Hospital and came back and brought those techniques to Evansville. A lot of those professional nurses didn't marry. And then, they would basically live together in groups for the rest of their lives. So that experience bonded them. They had allowed women in the American Legion, but only some of them. I think the max number of women they let in was like 8. And they were all these women who served in the war were always trying to find each other, because they put notifications in the newspaper, or they want to find each other. They wanted that connection. Other women, they got married and they went on to live, very period typical upper middle class to wealthy lives, and kind of all of the things that come with those social statuses. And others, some of the student nurses had the most interesting stories. One named Hazel went on to travel regionally for a while playing baseball in an industrial league in about, from about 1920 to 1924. Pearl Janley got married. She met a wounded soldier, and they ran a business together because he'd lost an arm and was very disabled. So they had to kind of work in business equally to make it work. And they did that. She did that for the rest of her life. Irma Brady went and played Carnegie Hall as a musician. She was one of our theater performers that went overseas, like with what became the USO. And so she played Carnegie Hall, traveled, did the vaudeville circuit, did a lot, eventually into the RKO studio system in the 30s. And then others, just, had kind of normalized, got married, had kids, and they did kind of disappear. And then there were others who struggled and what they showed real symptoms of what we would recognize now as trauma. And what, we know one story that we can confirm with family where she never did recover. And it was a trained nurse who was responsible for transporting soldiers from the battlefield when they go to those evacuation posts, and they put those soldiers on trains and then they take them to the next level of care. And she, you can imagine the condition that those men come off on, and what those very tiny packed trains with little light, and she had to keep them alive to get to the next point. And she kept her head shaved because of her sort of fear of lice. So there was a cost as well, and some of the women were able to sort of put that away and move on, and others were not. So I think that's one thing we don't think about and don't hear about. We rarely hear women's war stories, and we rarely hear the full story when we do hear them. And so that's something we always need to keep in mind and recognize that, that they're whole people, and had a whole range of experiences and consequences. And we need to honor that.
I feel like you just took the question right out of my mouth that I was about to ask, which is, why is it important to remember these women's stories as we approach the 102nd anniversary of Armistice? So that was very beautifully said, Amber. I do want to bring it back to the project with this kind of last final question. I know you mentioned the organizations that you're working with on the documentary and whatever written form the eventual project becomes. But could you kind of finish off our evening tonight telling us a little bit about how you got those organizations on board to assist with this project, and what that next step is for the project since COVID derailed it a little bit?
Sure. Well, Evansville Wartime Museum is a relatively new organization here, and they're doing amazing work. They just brought a World War II era airplane back to Evansville, because we have quite the history in the city with World War II. So, and one of the things that they have said they wanted to do more of is honor the stories of women veterans. Because it's not something we always do on your first and second look. So I really give them credit for placing an emphasis on that and being willing to join with this project. I think it's really important and should be commended. And then Tri-State Women Veterans, they are an organization that was created because a lot of women veterans don't feel comfortable in some of the other service organizations or places for veterans that exist for one reason or another. And they have an incredible community they've created to support each other. They have younger veterans that served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and their oldest veteran just really recently passed in the last few weeks. She served as a nurse in World War II. So they have the experience of multiple generations that they can draw upon and reminisce and support each other. And I really wanted them involved because we don't have, except for in the cases where there are letters, and even then they were censored letters, we don't have these women to ask. We're putting the stories together the best that we can. And we hope we're doing the best job that we can do, and we're honoring them in a way that they would feel comfortable and proud of. But we really don't have their voices. So having the Tri-State Women Veterans to fall back on, women who have served in combat, women, who have fired weapons in combat, women who have treated soldiers and Marines in combat is an incredibly valuable resource. And they honor us by being willing to open up and share those experiences and give us insight as to, you know, what the emotions of these women might have been, or you know, what funny stories they might have had in the background that we aren't going to get from a newspaper article. So we're really honored to have them as a partner in the project, and they're definitely an organization that should be supported in any way that we can support them.
Amber, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for talking about this project tonight. And I, you know, obviously I don't know any of these World War I women personally, but I like to think that they would be incredibly proud of the work that you are doing to uncover their stories. And thank you so much for uncovering them, because they're fascinating to hear, and very humanizing. So thank you so much.
Thanks for letting me share them. And you can follow the project at inserviceofmercy.org. We've got a trailer up, and then you know, as things kind of evolve and we know a little bit more as to what our timelines are going to be, then I'm sure we'll update the information there as well.
Perfect. I believe Callie put both of those links in the chat for our participants this evening. Watch the trailer. It gave me chills. Follow along with the project, everyone. It is a worthwhile thing to follow along with. And with that, I believe that is Callie's signal for me that she's taken back over. So thank you very much, Amber.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for the great conversation. Amber knows that I love finding out everything she's finding in her archive. And if you ever want to know about a good Prohibition murder mystery or know about Prohibition in Evansville, Amber's the one to talk to, because I have a lot about that. And thank you all so much for coming tonight to listen to our conversation. We're taking a break next week from History Happy Hours, but please consider joining us on November 19th as we explore more about Kurt Vonnegut. If you'd like to join that conversation, you can find ways to sign up at indianahistory.org. And if you're interested in more virtual events, we have so much coming to an internet-connected device near you. Just in the next week, you can learn about Indianapolis's city parks through the years, learn more about Indiana's Latino history, explore historic housing inequalities in the city and how we can find more equitable solutions today, and then join us around a virtual campfire to find out about Native American origin stories. Plus, if you can join us and you feel comfortable to join us in person, grab your advance tickets, mask up, and come see Festival of Trees that's opening up in just a few short weeks. So you can find out about all of that at indianahistory.org and so much more to come. If you missed your chance to donate or would like to make a future gift to support the Indiana Historical Society, you can visit the link that Cheyenne just dropped in the chat box below. Your donation allows us to keep sharing Hoosier stories and events like this, and we really appreciate it. You're going to get an email from us tomorrow with the links that we shared in the chat, plus a survey. I promise you it takes 1 minute, and we'd love to know what you thought, how we can make programs like this better in the future, and what you want to hear about next year as we're scheduling more History Happy Hours. This conversation will be posted to YouTube in the upcoming weeks, along with on IHS's webpage. And with that, thank you so much for coming. We hope you stay healthy and sane, and we can't wait to see you in the future. Night, everybody.
Amber, as always, it is an absolute pleasure getting to talk to you about this project.
Thanks for having me. And people, I can see people.
So y'all can turn your videos back on. I can't remove Diane, but I feel like we've, oops, I accidentally allowed her to talk. I think we've tried to remove her, so she will.
It's showing up as 0 on my end.
Oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay. Nice job, everybody. Especially Bethany, that flowed like butter for like a very quiet chat. I'm glad we could just kind of make that work.
Been on a few of these.
Amber, did it feel good to you?
What? You broke up there?
Did it feel good to you?
Yes.
Good. I enjoyed it. I like all the